Okay, so in this update, the engineer tower has actually changed, and for most people, they've said that it's been buffed. Now, we've kind of been hinted at this change for the engineer previously in the balance and feedback channel when one of the testers, I think the head tester, speculated that there was meant to be, or there is planning to be, a engineer change which completely changed the engineer in terms of its rework, including the fact that it's able to bypass defense. However, in this case, this seems to be a stopgap thing, a stopgap change in its statistics, so that it can become more powerful. But the changes, the full changes that's going to be made to the engineer will become at a later date. Now, interestingly, there is a change to the engineer right off the bat. The engineer previously it used to cost $750 to place down, and now it only costs $600 to place down, meaning that in some game modes such as Fallen mode and Molten mode, you're able to place down an engineer right from the very start, as opposed to previously which you would have had to wait, like a wave for example. Now, there has also been another change to the engineer tower itself, and it's that the dead zone range for the engineer has actually increased slightly from 1 to 1.5. Now, this isn't actually that much of a big deal, because the dead zone range is only the range where the engineer can't build a sentry, and all it really needs is a slither, a little bit of space around the engineer so that the sentry can be built. So an increase, a slight increase in the dead zone range, it's not really that much of a big deal. Now, what is a slight deal is the fact that the Sentry itself, its fire rate has actually increased from 0.45 to 0.6, thereby meaning that the DPS for the Sentry has decreased from 2.18 to 1.64. However, with that being said, the scrap meter, the amount of shots or the amount of damage that the engineer is required to do before it can build a Sentry, has actually been nerfed from 16 to 8. So actually it's a buff for the engineer if you really think about it, because previously it would have required a minimum of 4 shots, 4 full damage shots for the engineer to build a Sentry, whereas now it only requires 2 full damage shots, which is pretty good. This means that the effect of only dealing a small amount of damage to an enemy, such as the abnormal, or dealing 1 damage to abnormal, is significantly reduced with this rework. So yeah, the engineer is slightly better, I would say, especially with the cost decrease. Now, this does mean that with the engineer, the level 0 engineer itself, while the tower itself hasn't changed in DPS 3.31, the combined DPS of the engineer and the max amount of sentries that it can have has slightly decreased from 5.49 to 4.95, meaning that the cost efficiency has actually slightly decreased, and cost efficiency being decreased is better for the engineer, so it's decreased from 136.61 to 121.21. As for level 1, the fire rate for the engineer has decreased from 1.2 to 1, meaning that it is more likely that it can build its sentry faster if it's stunned, for example, or if it's not dealing enough damage for its shots. The shots that the engineer may be dealing could only be 1 damage, but most of the time it's going to be stuck at 8 scrap. Meanwhile, the range for the engineer at level 1 has also increased from 15 to 16. Now, you have to contend with the fact that the engineer itself, the sentry that is built, is slightly weaker than it was previously. And also, the upgrade cost for the engineer at this level has increased from 250 to 350, but actually the total cost for the engineer has slightly decreased from 1,000 to 950 because of the price decrease at level 0. This means that the engineer tower itself, its DPS has actually slightly increased from 4.97 to 5.95. And the combined DPS, when you also factor in the Sentry, has slightly increased as well from 7.15 to 7.59, despite the fact that the Sentry itself has gotten slightly weaker. This means that the cost efficiency for the engineer has gone from 139.86 to 125.16. Meanwhile, at level 2, the engineer's price upgrade has changed from 400 to 550, so 150 increase at this level. This means that the total cost for the engineer has increased from 1,400 to 1,500. However, there have been changes to the engineer's damage at this level. The tower has gone from 6 damage to 10 damage, and the fire rate, because of the change at level 1, has gone from 1.2 to 1. the range has also changed from 1.2 to 1, and the Sentry that it builds at this level hasn't changed apart from the previous changes that's been mentioned. The next change would be for the Rifle Sentry, which would be at the next level. What has changed is actually the maximum amount of units that the engineer can build at this level. Previously it was 2, however now it is just 1. The Sentry can still only build 1 Sentry. However, with that being said, because the engineer deals 10 damage at this level, it means that one shot, effectively, sometimes, most of the times, and it can build a Sentry. Like, yeah, effectively, the Sentry building stuff doesn't really matter between level 0 and level 2 because the engineer, most of the time, is instantly able to build it. Now, what this means for the DPS of the engineer is that the tower itself, its DPS has increased from 4.97 to 9.92. Very good. And the DPS of the previous engineer at level 2, interestingly enough, was only 9.833 when you consider the 2 Sentries that the engineer could build, whereas now it is 11.56. This therefore means that the cost efficiency for the engineer has gone from 150.05 to 129.76. Now, as for level 3, the engineer's upgrade cost has increased from 1,800 to 2,250, meaning that the total cost for the engineer has increased from 3,200 to 3,750. Now, at this level, the damage for the engineer has increased from 12 to 15, so a modest change. The fire rate has still decreased from 1.2 to 1 because of the changes at level 1, and the range for the engineer is increased from 17 to 18. However, what's interesting is apparently the dead zone range of the engineer has slightly increased from 1 to 1.5 because of the changes at level 0, but apparently the build range for the engineer has actually decreased at this level from 4 to 3. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this is the case because visually, if I upgrade this, it doesn't look like the build range for the engineer actually decreases, so it may just be like an internal thing where the build range for the engineer actually decreases, but from what I can see, it doesn't look like it decreases, so maybe this is just an error. So as for changes to the Rifle Sentry, its damage remains the same at 2, but the fire rate has decreased from 0.3 to 0.25. Therefore meaning that the DPS for the Rifle Sentry has slightly increased from 6.49 to 7.75. So, at level 3, the DPS for the engineer tower on its own has increased from 9.93 to 14.88, but when you combine it with the Sentry that the engineer can build down, and bearing in mind it can build 2 Sentries now at this level, it means that the DPS for the engineer tower, considering the Sentry, has increased from 22.91 to 30.38, and a cost efficiency going from 139.68 to 123.44, lower cost efficiency being better. Now, at level 4, the upgrade cost has changed from 3,000 to 4,750, meaning that the total cost for the engineer has increased from 6,200 at level 4 to now 8,500. However, for these changes, the damage for the engineer has increased from 18 to 30. The fire rate remains the same at 0.75 at this level, but the range has increased from 18 to 20. And actually, you can see the change in range decrease more clearly at this level. So you can see the range, the build range of the engineer at this level. And then if you go to level 3, it does actually look smaller. So actually, maybe the change in range, build range, is actually at level 4 and not level 3, as the statistics might suggest. Anyways, there's no changes to the maximum amount of units that the engineer can spawn in at this level. It is still at 3, meaning that the DPS for the engineer has increased from 23.75 to 39.58. But when you consider the maximum amount of Sentries that the engineer can build at this level, which is 3, the DPS has gone from 43.22 to 62.83, meaning that the cost efficiency has gone from 143.45 to 135.29. I would also like to point out that the rifle scrap meter, the Rifle Sentry scrap meter, has gone from 36 to 45, but this is just to counterbalance the fact that the engineer has had a damage increase at level 3 and level 4. So at level 3 it would require 3 max hits damage shots to actually spawn in a sentry, whereas at level 4 it would only require like 1.5 because it deals 30 damage. So the engineer can easily regain the amount of sentries if it's lost through stuns, for example, although this is unlikely the case because it does have a bubble shield which allows the engineer or the engineer sentry to withstand 1 stun from a enemy that would normally damage or destroy the sentry. Meanwhile, at level 5, the upgrade cost has increased from 12,500 to 13,500. This means that the total cost for the engineer has increased from 18,700 to 22,000, quite a hefty increase. However, the damage at this level has increased from 30 to 60, and the fire rate has remained the same at 0.75. The range has slightly increased from 18 to 20 as per the previous level. More importantly is the changes to the war machine, or not the war machine, the minigunner sentry that the engineer can build at this level. Its damage has actually slightly decreased from 5 to 3, but the fire rates for these minigunner sentries, they've changed from 0.16 to 0.1. The scrap meter has also changed from 120 to 180. However, previously the engineer could only damage enemies 30, whereas now it can damage enemies 60. So previously you would have looked at about 4 shots to have built a sentry, whereas now you are looking at only 3 max damage shots. Obviously, most of the time the engineer probably is dealing slightly less because of the way that defense works, and it's not always dealing a max amount of damage to an enemy, for example if it has 1 health left. But this does mean that the minigunner sentry, its DPS has actually slightly decreased from 29.76 to 27.78. However, when you look at the engineer as a whole, its DPS singularly has gone from 39.58 to 79.16, and the combined DPS has increased from 128.86 to 162.5, and the cost efficiency has gone from 145.12 to 135.38. And finally, for level 6, the upgrade cost has actually remained the same at this level, 35,000. However, because of the previous changes to upgrade costs, its final upgrade price, total price at this level has increased from 53,700 to 57,000, which isn't actually too much of a big deal on the grand scheme of things, so fair enough. For this, the damage for the engineer has increased from 50 to 85. The fire rate remains the same at 0.6. However, it appears that the build range for the engineer has actually slightly decreased as well, as you can see here. It's gone apparently from 3 to 2 from level 5 to level 6. However, previously it used to be 4. Now, I have no idea why the build range for the engineer decreases as you upgrade the engineer. Perhaps it's just to make sure to, I don't know, tell which sentries are associated with another engineer or whatever. I don't know, but it's very interesting that the build range decreases as the engineer is upgraded. The dead zone range also used to previously be 0.5, whereas now it is 1.5. I mean, dead zone range doesn't really matter, so fair enough. The maximum amount of units remains the same at 4. However, there are some changes to the War Machine Sentry, because previously it used to deal 8 damage, whereas now it only deals 3 damage. However, previously the rockets that the level 6 engineer, the War Machine Sentry, used to produce dealt 35 damage, whereas now they deal 70 damage. Very interesting. The fire rate has also decreased from 0.12 to 0.1, and the rocket's fire rate remains the same at 4. The scrap meter has slightly increased from 250 to 340, but in the context of the damage buff for the engineer, that's fair enough. So, this means that the DPS for the War Machine Sentry has gone from 80 to 62.78, and overall, the DPS for the Engineer Tower itself has gone from 82.24 to 139.8, and the combined DPS has actually slightly decreased for the Engineer. It's gone from 402.42 to 390.92. This means that the cost efficiency has gone from 133.44, one of the best ones for the engineer, best levels previously, to 145.81, definitively the worst cost efficiency for the engineer now. Now, I can easily see why the developers may have done this, because the engineer, it's not usually buffed by stuff like, say, the medic, the DJ booth, the commander, right? It means that the previous DPS that the engineer used to have was all tied up in sentries which could not be buffed, whereas now actually a third of the level 6 engineer is now tied up with the tower itself, which can be buffed, and at previous levels it's now about a half, whereas previously it was like 20% of all of the DPS that the sentry could do. So you'll see that at all of the levels for the engineer, the tower itself has more DPS, meaning that that is the DPS that can be buffed by the DJ booth, the commander and the medic. And the sentry, even though they have less DPS for the most part, the combined DPS, apart from for level 6, has slightly increased. So yeah, even though I think the engineer overall has been buffed, you may argue at level 6 the engineer is slightly weaker, which I guess is a trade-off given the fact that the engineer is actually now more useful earlier on, and a lot more useful when you upgrade it up until level 6 where it's slightly been nerfed.